What is it like to drive for Uber and Lyft in New Orleans? I just got back from Mardi Gras being in New Orleans for roughly about a week, and I talked to a lot of drivers, and this is interesting, both taxi drivers and Uber and Lyft drivers, because New Orleans in general is a really unique place when it comes to rideshare driving. Now, I want to say first off, I have a link listed below in the description to the video I posted about Mardi Gras. It was crazy. And secondly, here's a map of the bonus zones in New Orleans while Mardi Gras was going on. As you can imagine, pretty ridiculous surges in general because, of course, it's Mardi Gras and there's a lot of people ordering Ubers and Lyfts. Now, getting into the nitty-gritty, what is it like to drive for Uber and Lyft in New Orleans? First off, I think a lot of people, when considering driving, want to know how much money can you make? I think that's the biggest thing people want to know. The average amount I got, which kind of makes sense in terms of the country average, is 20 to 25 an hour. I say that a lot. When people ask me like, hey Mark, how much does the average Uber driver and Lyft driver make? I say 20 to 25 an hour on average. It does fluctuate, and that is the average amount I got from Ubers and Lyft drivers, basically saying, look, this is what we typically make. Now, the second thing, which I thought was very interesting in New Orleans, and let's ignore Mardi Gras for a second, because as you can imagine, if you're driving, let's say in Austin, Texas for South by Southwest, that's a very different experience than driving in Austin normally. Same thing with pretty much anywhere else. If let's say you're driving in Vegas, driving during EDC, very different than driving normally in Vegas. So let's ignore Mardi Gras. Talking about New Orleans specifically, the big interesting thing I noticed talking to a lot of drivers was the airport. Now, in case you didn't know, the airport is actually located in a city called Kenner. It's about 30 to 45 minutes away from New Orleans, right? So the airport, very similar to like say Denver, Colorado, for example, is pretty far away from the kind of heart of the city of New Orleans. Even though technically it's still called the New Orleans Airport, it's actually located in Kenner. And I know for a lot of drivers, they tell me that those airport rides pay a lot of money. A lot of money, especially like say when Mardi Gras was happening, although that was a very unique, isolated incident, you know, they said that typically they're gonna get like say $15 is what one driver told me. You get a $15 bonus for every ride when doing an airport ride on top of whatever you're getting paid. So as you can imagine, it's very advantageous to do those airport rides. And when it comes to New Orleans, one big thing a lot of drivers told me, or I heard from a lot of drivers, is basically that there's always different events going on. You have things like Jazz Fest, the French Quarter Festival, of course, Mardi Gras. There's always stuff going on, especially a lot of music-related events. So they told me that as a result of that, there's constantly airport rides, and those airport rides pay a lot. In addition, for better or for worse, depending on how you look at it, New Orleans is a very alcohol-focused city. So I heard from a lot of drivers that, as you can imagine, you're doing a lot of rides with people who have been drinking, who are inebriated, right, and want to be safe and, of course, responsible. So they order Ubers and Lyfts. There was one waiter I had when I was at a brunch in New Orleans that said, and I quote, "You have to be an alcoholic to survive in New Orleans." Now, whether that's true or not, I will say that I noticed out of any place I've ever been to, people in New Orleans drink the most. And so when it comes to rideshare driving, bring that now back to this video, that equals more people ordering Ubers and Lyfts to be safe and responsible, which equals more money in your pocket. But like I said, I think because the average is about 20 to 25 an hour, ignoring the airport rides, I feel like New Orleans seems to be a very tight-knit city where the rides or drives that you're doing aren't super, super far in distance depending on what you get, right? So that is one thing I do want to say. Now, what's interesting about New Orleans that I want to mention on this video, which I thought was very unique compared to most cities, is taxis. I mentioned that in the beginning of this video, being like, look, I talked to taxi drivers and Uber and Lyft drivers. Now, I have done a couple videos, I've mentioned here and there about the rideshare versus taxi debate. This has always been something that's been going on a lot. Very comparable to, like, say, Airbnbs versus hotels. Pros and cons on both sides. One really interesting thing, though, is dealing with the airport. Like I mentioned, the airport's about 30 to 45 minutes away. It's in Kenner, so it's about, like, again, 30 to 45 minute drive, if I'd say. And as a result of that, what's interesting is the city, I remember a taxi driver explained this to me. The city has a law that if you're a taxi driver, so remember, you're a taxi driver that's registered and everything, you can only charge a maximum, at least the exact time of this video, $36 for a ride. whether you're going from New Orleans proper to the airport or vice versa. It cannot go beyond that. However, when I was in New Orleans and I went to get a Lyft to Uber from the airport, I did not know this, and the Lyfts and Ubers were roughly about $60-ish. So that's a very interesting thing, because I was talking to the taxi driver who said, look, I consider driving for Uber and Lyft, but I actually get just way better rates and pays and everything by being a taxi driver, because one, it's a fixed amount. So people are like allowed to pay that. And he said, in addition, if let's say Uber and Lyft charges the passenger $60 or $70 or a crazy surge amount, what does the driver actually get from that? Not that much. And I remember I got one Lyft and Uber from a hotel I stayed at that was near the airport. It wasn't from the airport, but it was near the airport. I think it was like $40 is what the Uber and Lyft was that I got. And I was talking to the driver, and we were talking about Lyft and Uber, right? So he felt comfortable to be like, hey man, do you mind if I ask you a question? How much did you pay for this ride? Like, just out of curiosity. And I was like, okay, no problem. I paid $40. And he said, see, this is what's going on. I paid $40. He's only getting $18 is what he told me. So that's a $22 difference between what Uber and Lyft's getting and what he's getting paid. And what this taxi driver told me is that although, yes, you may think, oh, well, if you're an Uber and Lyft driver and you're getting a $60 ride from the airport, you're probably getting more money than, like, say, if you're a taxi driver, where legally you have to only charge $36. I will say, as a quick side note, might as well put an asterisk on that. If there's more people, which is kind of weird, if there's more people in the taxi driver is allowed to charge more. It's $36 up to 2 people. Anything past that, I think is like $15 extra per person or $5 extra per person, something like that. But you think, okay, well, the Uber and Lyft drivers are going to be making more. Not the case. Turns out that he was telling me that he made more as a taxi driver, even though at first glance, the rides are cheaper because it's a fixed $36 amount. But because he was getting so many, and because he's getting more out of that in general, he's making more money than most Uber and Lyft drivers. Now, granted, of course, I think that a big caveat to this, and this is why every city is very different. This is why I do these videos about what is it like to drive in Boston or Austin or Los Angeles, or what other videos I've done this series? Costa Rica is one that I did, right? Basically, any single time I travel and I'm in a place for a long period of time, I interview all the drivers, collect all their data, and then make these videos about what it's like to drive in that area. And it's interesting that in New Orleans, the airport rides are so common and popular, which makes sense, especially on festival and touristy times, that it does kind of bring this whole debate of, okay, driving for Uber and Lyft versus driving for a taxi, which one's better, which one's worse? And to be honest, I can't say 100% either way which one's better or worse in general, right? Because it might fluctuate. It might depend. Of course, I was talking about Mardi Gras and other festivals and events, but let's say on just a normal weekend, which one is better is tough to say. From my perspective, at least as I understand it, I think if you're mainly doing a lot of airport rides, it seems like being a taxi driver is better than being an Uber Lyft driver. However, if let's say you're just driving people around the French Quarter, for example, with places like Bourbon Street or Frenchman Street, maybe being an Uber Lyft driver could be better given those surge pockets and everything, but it does fluctuate. It is tough to say. And I want to mention that on this video because I feel like for most videos, when I compare, let's say, taxi driving versus Uber and Lyft, typically I say, look, in this city, in this area, you get paid a lot being a rideshare driver, drive for Uber and Lyft. I don't even mention being a taxi driver. However, in New Orleans, and I'm not sure why, it could be maybe the legal aspects of being a driver, it could be the city's layout, it could be just the mathematics, tough to say. It seems like there is a fair debate that, like, if you are considering being an Uber Lyft driver, to say, you know what, maybe I shouldn't do Uber and Lyft. Maybe I should actually be a taxi driver instead because you are going to make more money. Now, granted though, this is something you have to kind of weigh out. Maybe in the future, I should do a dedicated video about this because it does fluctuate city to city and state to state, of course. Where being a taxi driver, typically you have to do a lot more stuff, for lack of a better word, to be a taxi driver in terms of all these different things with your license and the legal aspects, and you have to do a lot more. With Uber and Lyft, you pretty much sign up and you can drive with your own car. So the barrier to entry being an Uber driver and a Lyft driver is significantly lower than being a taxi driver. But at the end of the day, the biggest things that I notice when talking to a lot of drivers is one, the average pay, which I think is the biggest thing people want to know, is $20 to $25 an hour. That is the average pay for the average Uber and Lyft driver in New Orleans. The second thing is a lot of these rides, in terms of the high-paying rides, revolve around the airport rides, going back and forth between the airport in New Orleans, aka New Orleans and Kenner. And then third, or lastly, it seemed like that the taxi culture around New Orleans is a lot more prevalent compared to most cities that I've been to, especially when it comes to the laws and the legislation, which is why I want to bring up the point that, like, so if you are considering driving full-time in New Orleans, it's not a bad idea to also consider being a taxi driver.